Straw Hat with Rabbi David Wolkenfeld and guest co-host Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm. We are the official podcast of Anshe Sholom B'nai Israel Congregation, an Orthodox synagogue in the Lakeview neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois.
So I am very excited to introduce Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, our guest for this episode of the Straw Hat podcast. Rabbi Lamm is the CEO of the B'nai Zion Foundation. Welcome to the Straw Hat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really happy that you're joining, and especially this week. So first, can you just tell us what is the B'nai Zion Foundation? What do you do for them? Tell us a little bit about your work there.
Sure. I'm the CEO of the B'nai Zion Foundation. It's actually the oldest Zionist order in the United States. It was founded in 1908. Our purpose has always been investing in the infrastructure of the state of Israel and building up the Jewish dream in its homeland. So we made the initial investment into what eventually became the Magen David Dome. We opened up B'Tzalel College, which is the oldest institution of higher education in Israel. And our vision for moving forward is partnering with the Jewish people's friends and allies in other communities of faith. So I am still only about 3.5 months into this position, so still getting my arms around it, but it's just an incredible place. I'm looking forward to moving it ahead.
Well, it's quite a legacy, B'Tzalel College and Magen David Dome. So whatever you come up with next that matches the impact of those organizations, institutions.
Exactly. Michael El Chayil.
Exactly. Indeed. So I'm really very touched that you made time to come on the podcast this week. As a recording on Thursday, we're nearing the end of Shiva for your grandfather, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, who was a very important figure for the Jewish people, for the American modern Orthodox community. But of course, he was also your grandfather. So I just wanted, if you could share just some memories of him. What was it like to have such an illustrious grandfather, to have his name as your own name, and what it's been like in the aftermath of his death this week?
I'd say that my relationship with my grandfather developed in 3 stages. There's the youthful era where it's difficult to tell him from any other grandparent. I mean, he was exceptionally doting and we adored him, but, it wasn't like we could tell that he was an especially important person other than in a familial sense. But, he always was so congenial and doting and loving, but we didn't know who he was. And then you get to adolescence, and that's sort of phase 2, where you begin to cognize that he's in some sense, a celebrity. My grandfather, just to give some background, was for many years, 2.5 decades, was a pulpit rabbi. He began at Kilas Jeshurun, KJ, as a disciple of Rabbi Joseph Lookstein on the east side of Manhattan. Then he went to Springfield, Massachusetts, where he became the rabbi there. And then he was asked to become first the assistant rabbi and then the senior rabbi at the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side, the legendary crown jewel of the synagogues in the Upper West Side. And while he was there, he was already a towering figure within the ranks of Orthodox intelligentsia. And, so in 1958, he founded Tradition, which was sort of at the time, really the only, and since then, became the premier journal of modern Orthodox thought. He launched the Torah Umada journal eventually, and he got his smicha from his rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University, and was a close disciple of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik. And for those of you counting at home, I suppose in the Chicago area, that's the brother of Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik. With
the T in the name.
Exactly. I actually tell you a story when Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik came to speak on the West Coast at Beth Jacob, which was my great uncle Moshe's shul, Rabbi Maurice Lamm, who wrote The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning. So when my uncle Moshe had Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, for a Skolin residence, he introduced him as the brother of Moreinu V'Rabbeinu, Maran Hagaon, Rav Joseph B. Soloveitchik, at the time was Shlita, Rav Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the Rav. And Rav Aaron Soloveitchik got up and said, usually I would take offense to such an introduction, but I guess it's okay coming from Norman Lamm's brother. So my grandfather and his brother, my uncle Maish, Rabbi Maurice Lamm, were really just two of the most extraordinary people I ever met. Both.
Pause for a minute and just reflect. So Rabbi Maurice Lamm, the author of The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning, which is a book that over the course of the decades, it passes into almost every Jewish household. Certainly, I've given out to many families, trying to accommodate situations of mourning. How is it that these two brothers both ended up as in very productive, illustrious, successful rabbinic careers, albeit with some different nuances in their focuses? What was the home that they grew up in like? Do you know?
It was a classic Glitzianer home. They had two parents who were real, just lovely, salt of the earth people, Pashta Yidden, and it's hard to know what drove them both to such heights. Their grandfather was a man by the name of Rabbi Yoshua Balma, was the author of the halachic responsa Emek Halacha, and he was a halachic decider early in America of some renown. His nephew and son-in-law, my grandfather and Uncle Maish's uncle, is a man by the name of Rabbi Yosef Balma, who founded the Crown Heights Yeshiva in New York. And so, I suppose they were from a deeply rabbinic family. They cared very much about the community, and that sort of brings me back to my second stage of growing up with my grandfather, which is adolescence, where you kind of realize who he is and what he's accomplished, whether at the Jewish Center, as a public thinker, beginning in 1976 as the president of Yeshiva University. But, so you understand that he has some degree of notoriety, and, you start to reap some of the benefits of it because, people treat you nicely, but none of the, and maybe even if people have outsized expectations for you, you don't really feel that burden because you're too young and you have plenty of time and people understand. So you sort of take it for granted, and it's truly a shame, but that's, I think, the way life goes. And then the third phase of my relationship with my grandfather is, I'd say near the end of high school, beginning when I began to study in yeshiva in Israel and then made my way back to Yeshiva University, where you realize who he is and how important and tremendous and extraordinary he is. And I said this to a friend the other day. It's sort of like when Mary Jane realizes that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, and you sort of go back over every single interaction you ever had with him. You're like, oh my God, that entire time he was a superhero. And, you start to re-examine every interaction you've ever had, and you almost have to relearn the history of your entire life over again, filling in all of your experiences with the knowledge that you now have of who this person is. And so, at that point in my spiritual development and intellectual development, it was just a mad dash to read as many of his books and writings as I could get my hands on. And eventually, when his sermons were digitized, in the beginning, my uncle, Rabbi Mark Dratch of the RCA, had them all to himself, as he likes to say. But eventually, when they became available, just devouring those, which were his true art and his true love, was, of top priority to me. And I began to learn with him very closely and study with him a great deal on a regular basis. And I finally, asked him to grant me rabbinical ordination, and he did. And that was perhaps the most special moment of my life. And, I suppose I'd say my only regret is that by the time I had plenty of time with him while he was still in his prime, but by the time I realized really who he was, and I guess this is true of all grandchildren, the time you really realize who your grandparents are, it's later than you wish it would have been.
That's right. That's definitely true, and a very poignant observation. I want to say, just turn back to his drashot and thinking about different rabbinic figures who excel in different genres of, there's like Rashi, the master of the short, pithy, comment, right?
Right.
Just the right number of words, no more, no less, right? And you have, others who, excel at great tshuvot, okay, and others who write, can just organize ideas into codes, right? Like the Rambam, right? Is an excellent organizer and conceptualizer of vast amounts of information. And the drasha, the sermon, as a distinct genre, as a particular like mode of rabbinic creativity is something that it's interesting to think about. Certainly, your grandfather was known for that. I think the Jewish Center as a congregation is still known actually as a congregation where they care a great deal about the sermon as a form of scholarship, as an art form almost, that mixture of art and scholarship. And I think your grandfather is very much exemplary in that. And it's great that we have not just the published editions. We can actually go back and see on that digitized archive his handwritten emendations and corrections to the original typed sermons. It's such a wonderful, wonderful resource.
Oh, I mean, it's the most magnificent source of contemporary Judaic thought that exists. And obviously I'm prejudiced, but he was yeah, I mean, this, and I don't think I'm alone in this assessment. He was the greatest orator of the 20th century, perhaps bar none, but certainly of the American Jewish scene, or of the Jewish scene globally. And he was not only a great orator, and there are many great speakers. Although, as my grandfather used to say about a particular person whose speaking abilities he admired, but whose content he was less than impressed by, he said he never has anything to say, but he says it beautifully. So, my grandfather wasn't only a great speaker, and it wasn't just that his content was rich and magnificent, but that he really thought from an artisan's perspective almost about the craft of drush, of homiletics. And I think perhaps his most indispensable piece of writing is an essay of his that he wrote called Notes of an Unrepentant Darshan, which you can get, you just type it into Google, you can get it for free online. And that's where he reflects on the art and science of composing sermons. And he has this wonderful line, which I'll never forget, where he says, and I think I'm getting the quote right, he says, if halacha is the science of Jewish religious life, then drush is its art, and aesthetics needs no apology in its claim to a rightful place in the sanctuary of Torah. It's one of my favorite lines that he's ever written. And he essentially asked the question. He says that what would life be without poetry? Poetry is the medium that humans have always used to express the most ineffable truths. You can write in prose about mitosis and about the theory of relativity and about any number of, about exogenous, shocks to the economy. You can write in prose about any number of mechanical things, but love, loneliness, loss, death, hope, those are the things that you require poetry for. And drush is the poetry of the Torah.
It's really, that's a beautiful metaphor, image, and it speaks to something very true. I mean, I guess I give drashot. When we had a show that was open for big crowds, I used to give drashot once upon a time. And it's definitely, in that capacity, you want to say something that's interesting, that's compelling, that's important, but then you want to craft it in a way that works aesthetically. And so that's definitely its own art form, absolutely. So I want to turn to some of his ideas that have gotten a lot of coverage and have been spoken about in the past, really the week since his death, and for good reason. He was really noted in a number of occasions and sadly, I think this was not something that exemplified the vast majority of his contemporaries for articulating a distinctly Jewish religious stance against racism in the American context. And over a series of drashot that he gave, this is a theme that he returned to. And so obviously that's something that we're all thinking about right now is yet again, our country is grappling with its original sin and its ongoing, perhaps greatest challenge. And somehow something very evocative that on the week of Rabbi Lamm's passing, his writings are so germane and so compelling and relevant to what we're all thinking about.
Yes, he felt very strongly, as a prelude to the question of civil rights and my grandfather's thought, he felt deeply, passionately about the importance of Torah thinkers and leaders addressing questions of contemporary relevance and importance. And, he has, again, and is, Notes of an Unrepentant Darshan is an explicit methodological reflection. But as far as I know, he only has one sermon of his. It's from 1970, and it's called Confessions of a Confused Rabbi. in which he actually doesn't even talk about anything in particular. It's purely a methodological reflection, and it's a response to a question that he had gotten after a sermon he had given 2 weeks before. And in it, he says, 2 weeks, he reveals, and I wouldn't have known this without having read the sermon. He refers to a sermon he gave 2 weeks before, which is a sermon of his that I love about ecology. And I actually didn't know that the week that he gave that sermon, which I happen to adore, that was the week of the Kent State shootings. And he did not address the Kent State shootings. And it was also the same, it was shortly after the Cambodian campaign began. He didn't address that either. And he begins his sermon for Parshas Bahar in 1970 by saying, 2 weeks ago, I spoke about ecology. And it was the Shabbos after the Cambodian campaign and the Kent shootings. And young people from the congregation met with me and asked me how come I did not, and they criticized me. He says, how come I did not address those issues? And he gives an entire sermon in which he lays out his thoughts about how, when, in what manner, and in what fashion rabbis should address contemporary politics and issues. And it is an absolute masterpiece. It's one of my favorite sermons, maybe my favorite sermon that he ever gave. And in it, he sort of begins at the very, very top by, laying out two extremes that he disagrees with. One is the question of politicization of the pulpit. And, he felt strongly that the Torah is much broader than politics. And so he has some sort of line, which I'm trying to remember verbatim, where he has some sort of line where he says a drasha can't sound like the editorial page of the New York Times with a couple of verses from the Torah tacked on. But he says at the same time, it's equally inconceivable to him that rabbis should sort of, keep politics out of the pulpit, because he says that's just a concession that the Torah is entirely irrelevant to the world. And to him, that was even more offensive than the idea that the pulpit might be politicized. And so, he then says, okay, there's obviously a massive gray area in between, but he was ferociously insistent that the Torah needed to be able to speak to contemporary issues. And he felt this from a very early age. I remember a sermon of his actually from 1952. It was just...
You remember reading a sermon of his from 1952?
Yeah. This wasn't a Back to the Future scenario. My DeLorean is safely parked in my garage. But I remember reading a sermon of his from 1952. I think it's either Vayetze or Vayishlach or Vayigash. It's one of those parashios, but it's basically right after the Korean War peace talks began. And he has this wonderful turn of phrase at the very opening of the drasha where he says, and again, I'm trying to remember the exact line, but it's something like, when the propaganda machines have ceased clattering and the partisan shouting has died down, that's when the Kol D'Mamadaka, the still small voice of religion, has to make its moral judgments and spiritual judgments known. And so he has this, he felt very strongly. The whole point of the Torah is that we believe, as a cardinal matter of faith, that the Torah is the greatest tradition of wisdom in the entirety of human civilization. And if you believe that, then it stands to reason by necessity that the world needs to hear from teachers of Torah. The more serious the teachers, the better. And if you believe that the Torah, that the Torah doesn't have anything to say about the great issues of the day, it's quite nearly heretical. And, it doesn't mean, therefore, that a Baal Torah, or rather a Ben Torah or a Bas Torah, needs to comment on every single thing that comes across his or her Twitter feed. That's certainly true. And it doesn't mean that the Torah, there's sort of like a one-to-one correspondence between Torah positions and political issues. But the idea that we should be, that not only we should be engaged with the world, but we have a moral responsibility, even when it makes us uncomfortable, and even if we'd rather not, to actually bring the traditions of which we are stewards out to the world, because the world needs us, and we're civilization's best hope as a people and as a tradition. I mean, that was a cardinal issue for my grandfather. So in the question of racism and civil rights, that was exceedingly important to him. And his particular take on it was, I think, fascinating. He particularly associated racism, and very few other things, by the way. If anything, I'd have to look through the drashas again, but my grandfather very explicitly associated racism specifically with the sin of idolatry.
Wow.
He thought that racism was a form of idolatry. He compared it several times to different elements of idolatry. So he has one sermon from, I want to say, 1964, where he compares the racism to the process of how racism worms its way into the human psyche, to the process by which the Jewish people made their peace with the Egel Hazahav, with the golden calf. In 1963, just after, I believe, the March on Washington with Martin Luther King, he gave a sermon where he compared racism to the sin of false weights and measures, which is tied by Chazal, by the rabbis, and by the Torah itself, by juxtaposition to idolatry. And the reason he felt that racism was tantamount to it was that he develops this idea that just like weights and measures, using false weights and measures, unlike adultery, with which the Torah juxtaposes it, adultery is a crime of passion, right? It's something that happens in the moment, and it's a matter of the heart. But to use false weights and measures, that requires premeditation, and it's cold and it's calculating, and that is a systematic crime or a systemic crime, much like idolatry. Idolatry requires a system of beliefs, and it's not something that just happens in the moment. It's something that requires a society that is baked into a society. And my grandfather felt that was precisely what racism was. And his particular take on it was actually most targeted at not sort of the objects of racism, but rather the white community in America. He felt very strongly, and this kind of goes to a larger dichotomy with which he was very taken. He refers to it several times in many other contexts in his sermons, between rights and responsibilities, right? So this is not his distinction, but the idea that the American system of democracy can sometimes be caricatured as being premised on rights, that we all have certain rights, and the Jewish tradition, and he felt that the American tradition rested on this as well, in its purest form, also imposed responsibilities upon each of us to treat other people in a certain way. And so that had two implications for him. He said, first of all, he felt that white Americans or non-Black Americans had a responsibility to stamp out the racism in their own hearts and communities. And he was ferocious about this. At the same time, because, again, he felt that stamping out racism was not a matter of one person's rights, but actually of our responsibilities, he also felt strongly that Jews had a responsibility to fight racism in the right way. And this is to go back to that sermon about the Confessions of a Confused Rabbi. One of the points that he makes is that he felt uncomfortable addressing the Kent State shooting. So he says, first of all, because he felt unsure about and the Cambodian campaign as well, because even though he had loudly and in his sermons opposed the Vietnam War, he was also a staunch anti-communist, and he also felt that communism was a form of atheism. And he felt that he wasn't sure that he knew enough, or that he had thought things through enough in order to address those two things. And he gives a couple of other reasons why he didn't want to address them. But the third one is because he questioned the priorities of many of the Jewish students who were involved in campus activism in the 60s. And my grandfather, I should say, I think perhaps his most heroic achievement as a rabbi, he stood up for civil rights, and he spoke out against apartheid and all these different, he spoke out against communism, all of these different things that he did. I think the most heroic thing that he did was that he was a rabbi in a Yekisha congregation, and he gave at least 3 sermons, of which I'm aware, defending hippies. So I think, my grandfather actually had a lot of sympathy for the hippies, and he felt that they certainly were the campus radicals of the 60s. He felt were far more righteous than their parents, sort of the establishment squares for whom he had nothing but moral contempt. But he did think that the campus radicals had gone so far, and it was precisely because they didn't have the restraining force of religion in their lives that they had gone the way that they went. So he really, he empathized with them, but he thought that they went not just too far. He thought that they actually did things that were terrible. And so he says, one of the things that makes him uncomfortable in supporting the campus radicals and their causes was that he was very bothered by the fact that Jewish students on the campuses who were involved in anti-racist causes, which he supported, vociferously. And again, compared racism to idolatry and spoke out against it many times. And it wasn't like these sermons made him very popular, but he felt very strongly about this. But he also felt that groups like the Black Panthers, whom he named specifically in several sermons, were evil. And on the one hand, he thought that the police treated them terribly, and he supported protesting against police brutality. But he was horrified by students who made a cause celeb out of the Black Panthers, because he said they're not our friends. They're anti-Semites and they're anti-Israel. And he felt that on the one hand, Kshani latzmi ma'ani, if I'm only for myself, then what am I? We have to be for others, and we have to stand against injustice when we find it. But it may not nili mili, and if Jews aren't going to stand up for Israel and for the interests of Jewish people, nobody else is going to do it. And so he was very perturbed by the fact that Jewish students made allies out of people who, although righteous in many of their aims, were also terrible people in many respects. And so I think the fact that my grandfather associated racism with idolatry allowed him to do two things that I think were unique in the rabbinic approach to racism at the time. I suppose three things. The first was that it allowed him to condemn racists as the highest level sinners that are possible in Judaism. It also allowed him to speak about the ways in which racism is systemic, not just a personal crime. It's something that requires and even takes advantage and thrives on an underlying culture that makes it possible. But three, it also allowed him to make human agents out of the people who fight racism. And the people who fight racism have a responsibility both to fight it, but also to fight against other injustices. And those injustices could be perpetrated by some of the fellow fighters against racism. And I think that's what made his thought about this unique.
Thank you for that summary. That's a voice that I think would be very valuable even now, especially now. I heard a story of a rabbi who was once told, "Rabbi, I appreciated your sermon so much; it really inspired me." And the rabbi responded, "Oh, it inspired you to do what?" Okay, and inspiration should move you, right, to do something. I think it was Rav Steinsaltz, I think, was told this. "Oh, what you just said really inspired me," and he said, "Inspired me to what?" So, can you share a little bit about what was the? Because it seems like he was in a hard position if his congregants were sometimes alienated by his very bold, forthright positions, and the campus activists in some senses were not natural allies of his for the reasons you mentioned. Was he able to take those ideas, and did they have leverage in the world? Did they have impact in a way that you can discern?
Yes. So it's funny, actually, in that very same sermon, which again, it's one of my favorites, Confessions of Confused Rabbi, he actually speaks directly to the students who asked him to speak about the Kent State shootings. And he said, I'm not sure that I agree with you. And he said, now, nevertheless, you may say, well, even if I don't agree with you, I have a responsibility to speak, perhaps not truthfully, but because if I don't speak about these things, I may lose young people from the synagogue. So he says quite forthrightly, if I do discuss these issues and I don't agree with you, should I speak the truth and alienate such people, or should I lie and make and make a liar out of myself? Or, and this gets to your question, he says, what about alienating the other people in my congregation? He says, the establishment adults in my community won't like it if I speak the truth either. Or rather, won't like it if I coddle you, and they certainly will like it if I coddle them. And he says, he explicitly says this in the sermon. He says, who's more important? He says, who's more influential? Who's more expendable? Should I consider, and should I take this into account at all when I speak about this? And do you think that me explicitly taking into account who I need more, the young people or the adults, do you think those kinds of considerations are more likely to make my sermon stronger or weaker? Or you think that's going to make them more attractive or more repulsive? And so he says, the best thing I can do then is to speak the truth as I see it. And I think one of the wonderful things about the Jewish Center is that as much as he had a congregation that certainly was full of very bright and accomplished people who had very strong opinions, there is a real culture of Kvod Harav in that synagogue to this day that I think positions the or encourages the Rav of the congregation to speak his mind in uplifting and inspiring ways, because I think there's an implicit trust that the rabbi has the congregation in good hands and cares about their souls and their spirits, and is a sort of a balanced person speaking from the perspective of the Torah. So I think it's one of the unique things about the Jewish Center culture, I suppose.
And you worked there, right? You had a position there at one point. Is that?
I did. I was the originally the rabbinic intern, then the resident scholar. And while my grandfather was in the pews, it was a real incredible opportunity for me. It was amazing.
Really nice. I had the experience of also once or twice speaking in his presence when I was a summer rabbi at Lincoln Square Synagogue, which I guess if the Jewish Center is the jewel in the crown of West Side shuls, then the Lincoln Square Synagogue is the flagship of modern Orthodoxy.
Right. Right. They might take offense though I described the Jewish Center.
So I was in a couple of years when I was working on campus. I was covering for Rabbi Robinson when he went away on summer vacation. So I gave a few drashot, and your grandfather was at that point, shifting around from the shuls on the west side. And so I think he heard me speak on one or two occasions, and that was intimidating, but really an experience that I treasure because he said something very kind to me afterwards. So that really meant a lot to me that he appreciated what I had said. So
I'll tell you, the first time that I spoke from the pulpit in the main sanctuary in the Jewish Center, I was given the privilege by Rabbi Yossi Levine, who's the senior rabbi of the Jewish Center, to give the drasha in the main sanctuary. And that morning I was walking to shul with my grandfather, and, he had slowed down physically by that time. So, we had to walk 3 blocks, but it was a nice long walk. So we had plenty of time to schmooze. And as we were walking, he knew I was speaking from the main sanctuary that morning. And so he said, what are you going to talk about? So I told him what I was going to say. And I gave him the whole thing from Aleph to Taf. And I was expecting a nice pat on the back and some grandfatherly pride. And then I was going to march in there and blow the roof off the place. I'll never forget, we were on Columbus Avenue. I finished telling him what I'm going to say, and he stops dead in his tracks, and he looks at me and he says, "That's terrible."
Oh, no.
And I had a panic attack, but he was never a critic for the sake of being a critic. He was always a constructive presence. And I'll never forget the rest of the walk. He asked me, what's your main idea? I told him the main idea. He said, okay, that's good. What are some of the nice turns of phrase you want? I gave him this, and he suggested some other things, and put this here and put that there, and then, fix this thing, and then you need to add something there. And but he, in the span of a minute, or however long, however many minutes remained to us as we walked to the Jewish Center, he had taken the entire thing apart, put it back together. And then he said to me, okay, so now all you have to do is figure out a little bit of this and that, and then remember this. And he said, it'll be fine. And I do not remember, I don't remember having said a single word of davening that day. I was so terribly nervous. And I have no memory of giving that drasha at all, because I was so terrified. But I think it went well because they asked me to do it again many times. And I do remember after delivering it, he was so proud and complimentary, and it was an incredible thing. And I know many people who have spoken in front of him, especially people closer in age to myself, but even old hats and experienced professionals like Rav J.J. Schachter or people like that, or Rabbi Levine himself, Rabbi Berman, Ari Berman, have all described the experience of speaking in front of him, and as one have characterized the joy that he took in listening to students of his and students try their hand at the craft of drush, of homiletics. To him, it was such a pleasure, and it gave him so much pride.
It's really great. My editor for Drashot is my wife, and
likewise.
I've learned to sometimes if I get the feedback without enough time to make the corrections, that's like, that's on me. So I try to give her a draft early enough so that if she says this is terrible, I have time to make corrections. So editing is really key in many fields. I love the story. It's a really lovely story. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it. And I just hope you have, your warm, inspiring memories of your grandfather continue to nourish you and your family for many, many years to come. And that you continue like your good work of sharing his Torah and his vision for what modern Orthodoxy should represent in the world, what the Torah should represent in the world, and how the Torah's message should be made relevant to all of us in the world today. So thank you for that good work and with the foundation as well, and for sharing just some of your time with us, with our listeners. Thank you very much.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. This was a total blast, and looking forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Straw Hats. As always, we'd love to hear your feedback. Let us know what you think. Please subscribe, rate us, share the podcast with your friends and family. We hope that you are all continuing to stay healthy and safe, and we hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.